The wind was cold that evening, carrying dust through the empty streets at the edge of the human settlement. Beyond the last row of houses, where no one liked to go, a small fire burned weakly against the wind. Beside it sat an alien woman and her little daughter, their thin clothes doing little to keep them warm. The woman's name was Lyra, and her skin had a faint blue glow under the dying light of the sun. Her daughter Suri was no older than 5, with big, bright eyes and small, pointed ears that twitched at every sound. They had been living like this for weeks, far from the main road, sleeping under a makeshift shelter made of torn cloth and broken wood. People in the settlement ignored them, or worse, threw insults when they passed by. Food was scarce, water even more so. Lyra had learned to make one small meal last for 2 days, but her daughter was growing weaker every morning. That evening, as Lyra tried to warm Suri's hands near the fire, she noticed movement in the distance. A tall figure was walking toward them from the direction of the town. Her heart tensed. Humans rarely came here, except to cause trouble. She grabbed Suri gently and pulled her closer, her eyes never leaving the shadow and the dust. The man stepped closer, and the firelight finally showed his face. He was human, dressed in worn clothes and a long coat. He carried a cloth bundle in one hand. His eyes looked calm but sharp, scanning the area, as if making sure no one followed him. Lyra's voice was quiet but firm. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer right away. He stopped a few steps away, crouched down, and set the bundle in front of them. When he opened it, the smell of warm bread and cooked vegetables filled the air. Suri's eyes widened, and she reached for it, but Lyra held her back. The man said simply, "It's for you." Lyra narrowed her eyes. "Why?" The man shrugged. "You need it." Then he stood up, turned, and began walking back toward the settlement without another word. Lyra stared after him, confused. No human had ever given them anything without expecting payment or some cruel joke. She slowly unwrapped the bundle and gave Suri a small piece of bread. The child ate quickly, crumbs falling into her lap. Lyra ate nothing, saving the rest for later, but her mind stayed on the man. Who was he, and why had he helped them? The next day, just before sunset, he came again. This time, Lyra didn't speak. She watched as he placed another bundle, this one heavier, near the fire. There was no smile, no small talk, only a quick nod before he left. Suri waved at him shyly, but he didn't look back. For the next week, the pattern continued. Every evening, just before dark, the man would arrive with food, sometimes bread, sometimes soup in a metal container, sometimes fruit. He always came alone, always left quickly. Lyra began to wonder if he was hiding these visits from someone. The townsfolk, however, noticed. One afternoon, Lyra heard voices nearby. "That Daniel's feeding the alien trash again," one man said. "Let him." Another laughed. "He'll regret it when they steal from him." Lyra didn't know his name until then. Daniel. She repeated it in her mind, unsure why it felt important. One evening, Daniel came later than usual, his coat wet from rain. He set down the bundle as always, but this time, he glanced at Lyra's arm. A dark bruise showed just above her sleeve. "Who did that?" he asked quietly. Lyra pulled her sleeve down and turned away. "It's nothing." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she saw anger in his eyes, not at her, but for her. After he left, Lyra sat in silence. Suri played with a small stone near the fire, but Lyra's thoughts were far away. Humans had taken everything from her: her home, her mate, her peace. Yet here was one human bringing food without asking for anything. She didn't understand it, and that made her uneasy. One night, after Suri had fallen asleep, Lyra looked up at the stars. She wondered how long Daniel would keep coming. Would he stop if someone told him to? Would he disappear like everyone else had? She shook her head and pulled the blanket tighter around her daughter. Whatever his reasons, his visits had kept them alive. But in a place like this, kindness never lasted forever, and deep down, Lyra feared the day when the stranger at the edge of town would not return. The next day, The wind carried the smell of rain across the settlement. Lyra sat close to the small fire, keeping her hands around Suri's shoulders to warm her. The little girl's cheeks were pale, her small frame shivering under the thin blanket. Lyra had been thinking about the man Daniel Lever since she learned his name. She told herself she didn't trust him, but her eyes still searched the path each evening. When the sun began to sink, she saw him again. Daniel walked steadily, carrying his familiar bundle. This time, when he reached the fire, he crouched down and placed the food closer. Inside was a loaf of bread, a jar of beans, and a small wrapped packet of dried fruit. Suri's eyes lit up. Daniel's gaze shifted to Lyra, and for a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say something. But instead, he gave a small nod and left. It became a rhythm, day after day. Daniel appeared at the same time, always with food. Sometimes it was fresh bread, sometimes roasted root vegetables, sometimes meat wrapped in cloth. Lyra never asked where he got it, and Daniel never explained. They spoke very little. His visits were quick, almost like a secret, yet, slowly, the silence between them began to feel less like distance and more like understanding. Suri started to wait for him. She would sit by the path, watching the horizon, her small pointed ears twitching when she heard footsteps. The moment Daniel appeared, she would smile, showing her tiny sharp teeth. One evening, she even ran forward to take the bundle from him herself. Daniel smiled faintly and patted her head, his hand gentle and careful. Lyra saw it, and her chest tightened with a strange mix of gratitude and fear. But not everyone saw kindness the same way. One afternoon, while Daniel was still in town, Lyra overheard two men near the water well. "He's going to ruin himself feeding them," one said with a sneer. "They're not worth it." The other replied, "Aliens bring trouble. Always have." The words stung, even though Lyra had heard worse. She turned away before they noticed her, but her mind was troubled. If the whole town hated them, what would happen if they found out Daniel cared? A few days later, Daniel came with more food than usual. He seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder now and then. When Lyra asked if something was wrong, he shook his head, but she noticed his knuckles were scraped, and there was a faint mark on his cheek. Someone had confronted him. She was sure of it. Still, he said nothing, just handed her the food and walked away into the dusk. The winter nights grew colder. Daniel started bringing not just food but also small pieces of firewood. "Found these," he'd say simply, placing them by the fire before leaving. Suri began talking more to him, telling him about her favorite foods and how she liked the stars. Daniel would listen quietly, sometimes answering with a few words. It was the most Suri had spoken since they'd lost their home. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Lyra finally asked, "Why do you keep coming?" Daniel paused, his eyes on the flames. After a long moment, he said, "Because someone should." He stood and left before she could say anything else. The words stayed with her long after he was gone. She didn't know what kind of man he was, but she knew one thing: he was different from the others, yet a shadow hung over their small corner of safety. Lyra knew that kindness always came with a cost in places like this. Someone would notice too much, someone would push too far, and when that day came, it might not just be her and Suri. In danger it might be him too. Still, every evening, she waited, and every evening, Daniel came. The food kept them alive, the wood kept them warm. But it was the quiet moments, the way he looked at Suri like she was worth protecting, that began to change something deep inside Lyra. She wasn't ready to admit it, not even to herself. But each daily visit was slowly breaking through the walls she had built around her heart. One night, as the stars spread across the sky, Suri curled up against her mother. Lyra stroked her hair and whispered, "We'll be all right." It was the first time she had said those words, and almost believed them, but somewhere deep down, she knew the truth. Life on the edge of the settlement was never safe for long. And Daniel's visits, no matter how steady, could not keep the storm away forever. The morning sun rose pale and thin over the settlement. Its light did little to warm the narrow streets, where wooden buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. In the market, the smell of bread mixed with the sharper scent of smoke. From nearby chimneys, people went about their business, their voices carrying in the crisp air, and in between the greetings and bargains. Another kind of talk was spreading low whispers, sharp words, and glances toward the edge of town. Daniel walked through the market with his hands in his coat pockets. He moved with the ease of someone who knew how to be ignored, but today, it was harder. A pair of merchants stood beside a cart, stacked with grain sacks. One leaned in and muttered, "That's him, the one feeding those aliens." The other shook his head, "Crazy or stupid, I can't tell which." Daniel heard them, but he kept walking. He had learned long ago that answering only gave people more to talk about. Still, the whispers were growing louder. Some called him a fool, others hinted at worse things. Daniel had seen this before, the way a community's suspicion could turn into something dangerous. He knew it was only a matter of time before words became actions, and that worried him more than anything. Out on the edge of town, Lyra was busy cleaning the area around their small camp. She had found an old bucket and was using it to carry water from the well. It was a long walk, and she hated going into the settlement. People stared at her, as if her very presence was a crime. She kept her head down, ignoring the muttered insults, but each trip left her more tense than the last. That evening, Daniel came as usual, carrying food wrapped in thick cloth to keep it warm. When he set it down, Lyra noticed the way his shoulders were tight. "You've been in the town," she said. Daniel nodded once. "People are talking." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. "About us." He didn't deny it. Suri, who had been sitting by the fire, looked up between them, sensing the weight in the air. Daniel sat for the first time since he'd started visiting. His boots left faint prints in the dust as he leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "They don't like that I come here," he admitted. Lyra gave a bitter smile. "They don't like that we exist." Her words were sharp, but there was no anger toward him in them, only a tired truth. In the days that followed, Daniel noticed more eyes on him in the streets. He was stopped once by a man with a rough beard. "Better stop wasting your food on them," the man said, his tone half warning, half threat. Daniel didn't answer, just stepped around him and kept walking. But the look in the man's eyes stayed with him. This was not just talk anymore. Meanwhile, Lyra found herself speaking to Daniel more during his visits. It began with small things, asking if the weather in the settlement was different, if there were any new market stalls. Then, slowly, she shared pieces of her past. She told him about her home before the war, about the fields where she used to walk barefoot with Suri when she was a baby. Her voice grew softer when she spoke of her mate, who had gone to fight and never returned. Daniel listened quietly, not interrupting. One night, the wind carried the sound of footsteps approaching their camp before Daniel arrived. Lyra froze, pulling Suri close, but when the firelight revealed Daniel, relief washed over her. He had come with more food than usually, enough for days. "You're not coming tomorrow," Lyra said, reading the look on his face. Daniel hesitated. "Not for a few days." He didn't explain, and she didn't ask, but the space between them felt heavier than ever. The next day, Daniel was seen in the settlement repairing the fence outside his small cabin. The whispers followed him still. Some said he was hiding something, others claimed he was bringing trouble to their town. Daniel kept working, his hands steady, even as his mind kept drifting back to the edge of town, to the blue-skinned woman and her small daughter waiting by the fire. That night, Lyra sat alone after putting Suri to sleep. The fire crackled weakly, and the cold crept in from all sides. She looked toward the path, knowing Daniel wouldn't come. The camp felt emptier without his quiet presence, and though she would never admit it aloud, she realized she had begun to count on him, not just for food, but for the strange, unspoken safety he brought. Back in the settlement, Daniel lay awake in his small cabin. He knew the gap between his world and theirs was dangerous. If the town turned against them completely, Lyra and Suri wouldn't stand a chance, and maybe neither would he. The whispers had started as background noise. Now, they were the beginning of something bigger, something that could burn through everything they had left, and in the quiet of the night, Daniel knew he would have to make a choice soon, one that would change all of their lives. Asterisk, the night air was colder than usual. The fire in Lyra's camp crackled low, throwing weak shadows against the rocks around them. Suri was curled up under a blanket, her breathing soft and even. Lyra sat awake, staring into the flames, her mind troubled. Daniel hadn't come for 2 nights now, and each day without him felt longer. She told herself it didn't matter. She had survived before he came. She could survive after, but the emptiness beside the fire said otherwise. The settlement was quiet in the distance, but out here, the dark had a different sound. Every rustle of the dry grass, every shift of the wind, felt sharper. Lyra's ears twitched at a faint noise, footsteps, slow and deliberate. Her body went tense. She glanced toward Suri, then reached for the small piece of metal pipe she kept hidden beside her. From the shadows, figures emerged, 3 of them, all human men. Their faces were partly hidden by scarves, but their voices carried clearly. "Well, look what we have here," one said with a smirk. Another laughed, the alien in her little pet camp. Lyra rose to her feet, keeping herself between them and Suri. Her voice was steady. "Leave us." The first man stepped closer. "We've heard someone's been bringing you food. Thought we'd check what's so special." One of them kicked the pot near the fire, spilling what little stew Lyra had made. Another grabbed at the blanket covering Suri, but Lyra struck his arm with the metal pipe. The man cursed and stumbled back, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret that," he growled. They began tearing at the shelter, ripping cloth and scattering the few possessions she had. Lyra fought to push them back, but one shoved her hard, sending her to the ground. Suri cried out, clutching her mother's sleeve. The men laughed and kept destroying the camp. Lyra's heart pounded. She couldn't fight them all, and no one from the settlement would help. Then, through the chaos, a voice cut through the night. "Enough." The men turned, and there was Daniel, standing at the edge of the firelight. His coat was dusted with dirt, and a rifle hung loosely in his hands. But it wasn't the weapon that made the men pause. It was the look in his eyes. Cold, steady, and unblinking. One of the men spat on the ground. "This your pet, Daniel?" Daniel stepped forward, the firelight glinting off the barrel of the rifle. "Get out," he said, his tone low but unshakable. The men hesitated, then began muttering curses as they backed away into the darkness. Their footsteps faded, leaving only the sound of the fire and Suri's quiet sobs. Daniel lowered the rifle and stepped closer. His eyes scanned the damaged, ripped shelter, the scattered food, the bruise already forming on Lyra's arm. Without a word, he knelt beside Suri, checking if she was hurt. Then he handed her a small wrapped piece of bread. She took it with trembling hands. Lyra's voice was tight. "Why are you here?" Daniel glanced up at her. "Because I knew this would happen." He began gathering the pieces of the shelter, setting them back into place as best as he could. Lyra watched him, unsure if she was angry at his words or relieved that he had come. When the fire was burning stronger again, Daniel sat near it. "I'll stay here tonight," he said simply. Lyra hesitated, her instinct telling her not to trust anyone that much. But when she looked at Suri, who was already leaning against Daniel's side, she didn't argue. The hours passed in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of night creatures. Daniel sat with his rifle across his lap, his eyes always moving. Lyra tried to rest, but her mind kept replaying the attack, the laughter, the shove, the helplessness. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this wouldn't be the last time. When dawn finally touched the sky with pale light, Daniel stood. "I'll bring you more food later," he said. Lyra's voice caught before she could answer. As he turned to leave, she found herself calling out. "Daniel." He stopped, looking back. Her words were quiet, almost reluctant. "Thank you." Daniel gave a small nod, then walked away, his figure fading into the morning mist. Lyra sat by the fire, holding Suri close. She could feel the weight of the night still on her shoulders, but beneath it was something else, a fragile, dangerous thought she hadn't dared feel in a long time: hope. The attack changed something. 4 days afterward, Lyra kept replaying the moment Daniel stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't just that he had stopped the men, it was the way he had done it, without shouting, without fear, just a steady, unshakable presence. It made her realize something dangerous. She trusted him. Daniel came every evening after that. He didn't speak much about the attack, but he always scanned the area when he arrived. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes firewood, and once, he brought a patched-up blanket that looked like it had been mended by hand. Suri loved it immediately, wrapping herself in it and refusing to let go. Daniel smiled faintly at that, the kind of smile that was gone before you could be sure you saw it. One night, as the fire crackled low, Lyra decided it was time to speak more openly. She waited until Suri had fallen asleep, her small hands curled under her cheek. Then Lyra said softly, "I haven't told you much about us." Daniel glanced at her, but didn't push her to continue. She took a slow breath. "My people lived far from here. Near the hills, we had fields and water, and we traded with other clans. Until the war." Her eyes reflected the firelight as she spoke. "They came in ships, humans, some to take land, some to fight, some to burn everything. My mate joined the defense, and I never saw him again." Her voice trembled, but she kept going. "When the soldiers left, the sickness came. It took my parents, my friends, and we had nothing left but each other." She looked toward Suri. Daniel listened, without interrupting, his face unreadable. After a long silence, he spoke. "I lost someone too." Lyra's head tilted slightly. "My sister," he said, his voice low. "She died during the first clashes." Wrong place, wrong time. Lyra studied his face, noticing how his jaw tightened as he spoke. "I blamed your people," he admitted. "For a long time, I thought all of you were the same." His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "But then I saw you, and I saw her. And it didn't make sense anymore." The words hung between them. Lyra wasn't sure what to say, so she only nodded. They sat in the quiet, the fire popping softly. Suri stirred in her sleep and mumbled something, her hand reaching out. Daniel, without thinking, adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. It was such a small gesture, but it made Lyra's chest ache. In the days that followed, Daniel began staying longer during his visits. Sometimes he would help gather sticks for the fire or check the edges of the camp for signs of intruders. Other times he would listen as Suri talked about the stars, or tried to teach him simple words from her language. He always tried, even when the words were hard for him. And every time he stumbled, Suri would laugh, a soft, genuine sound Lyra hadn't heard in months. Still, Lyra's guard was not completely gone. One afternoon, she saw two men from the settlement watching Daniel as he walked toward the camp. They didn't follow him, but their expressions were dark. That night, she told him, "You're making enemies." Daniel shrugged. "I've had enemies before. It's not the same," she said, her voice sharp. "They could hurt you." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "It's worth it." That answer stayed with her. She knew what it meant to risk everything for someone else, but she didn't understand why he would do it for her and Suri. And yet, each day that passed, she stopped questioning it as much. Instead, she found herself waiting for him, not just for the food or the safety, but for the strange feeling of calm that came with his presence. One night, while the sky was clear and the stars bright, Lyra asked him a question she hadn't dared before. "If you could leave this place, would you?" Daniel glanced up at the stars, his face lit by the fire. "Maybe," he said. "But I wouldn't go alone." Lyra's throat tightened at the words. though she didn't know why. She looked at Sori, who was tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an empty road. Still, deep inside, Lyra knew they were not safe. The settlement's whispers hadn't stopped, they had only grown quieter, more secret. Daniel's protection was strong, but it couldn't erase the hatred in the eyes of those who wanted them gone. And sooner or later, something would happen to test the fragile trust they had built. That night, as she lay awake, listening to the wind, Lyra realized she no longer feared Daniel's presence. What she feared now was losing it. The rain had been falling since morning. By evening, the camp was soaked, the ground muddy beneath Lyra's feet. The small fire sputtered and hissed, struggling against the wet air. Suri sat under the torn shelter, hugging the patched blanket Daniel had given her. Her little face was pale, her hair damp from the leaking roof. Lyra tried to keep her hands busy, adjusting the cloth walls, moving the firewood, but deep down she knew it was hopeless. The cold was sinking into everything, and Suri had been coughing since the night before. Lyra's stomach twisted with worry. In weather like this, sickness could spread fast. Through the sound of rain, she heard footsteps approaching. Her first instinct was to tense. Too many nights had taught her that footsteps could mean trouble. But then, a tall figure stepped into view, his coat soaked through, his hair dripping. Daniel. He didn't waste time speaking. Instead, he set down a heavy bag with a dull thud. Inside were rolls of bread, wrapped meat, and 2 folded wool blankets. "Where did you?" Lyra began, but he only shook his head. "You need these," he said, his voice rough from the cold. Lyra opened one of the blankets and wrapped it around Suri. The girl immediately curled into its warmth, her eyes half closing in relief. Daniel watched for a moment, then crouched down so he was eye level with Lyra. "You can't stay here," he said. She froze. "We've lasted this long," she replied, her tone defensive. "Barely," Daniel countered. His eyes were steady, the kind of steady that came when someone had already made up their mind. "I'm not saying for tonight. I'm saying, come with me, both of you." Lyra blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "To your place?" she asked slowly. Daniel nodded. "It's small, but it's dry, safe, and no one will bother you there." Her heart raced. For months, she had told herself that depending on anyone was dangerous. People left, people betrayed, people turned their kindness into chains. And yet, the thought of Suri sleeping in a warm bed instead of a soaked blanket sent a deep ache through her chest. "Why?" she asked finally. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Because you belong somewhere better than this," he said simply. "Because I can keep you safe." And because he hesitated, his jaw tightening as if holding back more words. "Because I want you there." The rain fell harder, drumming against the scraps of wood that made up the shelter. Lyra looked at Suri, who had pulled the blanket close and was watching Daniel with quiet hope in her eyes. Her daughter didn't understand the risks, the history, the dangers, but she understood warmth, and Daniel's presence was warmth. Still, fear clung to Lyra like the wet air. "What about the others in the settlement?" she asked. "They already talk," Daniel said. "Let them." His tone carried no hesitation, no concern for their judgment. She realized then that he wasn't offering this out of guilt or duty. He was offering it because he had decided they were worth protecting completely, openly, no matter the cost. Lyra's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "Moving with you. It changes everything," she murmured. Daniel leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "Everything needs to change." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Lyra's mind was a storm of memories, her home before the war, the nights, hiding from soldiers, the hunger, the cold, the way Sori had grown too quiet for a child, and then, the nights Daniel had arrived with food, the firelight on his face, the way he had stepped between them in danger, without hesitation. She took a deep breath. "If we come with you, no conditions, no debts." "No conditions," Daniel said. "No debts. Just a home." Suri's small voice broke in. "Can we go, Mama?" she whispered. Lyra's throat tightened. She looked between her daughter and the man in front of her. Then, finally, she nodded. Yes. Daniel's shoulders eased, though his face stayed calm. "Pack what you can," he said. "We'll leave when the rain slows." Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping the ground would catch her. For the first time in months, she felt the faint outline of something she'd almost forgotten, a future. The rain eased just before dawn. The air was damp and cool, and mist clung to the edges of the settlement. Lyra stood outside the shelter, her meager belongings bundled in a worn piece of cloth. Suri clutched the patched blanket to her chest, her eyes wide with excitement and uncertainty. Daniel approached quietly, carrying another small bag over his shoulder. He looked at the camp one last time, the charred fire pit, the broken scraps of wood, the dirt ground where Suri had played. Without a word, he turned toward the path and nodded for them to follow. The walk to his home was longer than Lyra expected. They passed through the edge of the settlement. People glanced at them, some with surprise, others with disapproval. Lyra kept her head high, though every stare felt like a weight. Daniel walked close beside them, his hand resting on the strap of his bag, ready for anything. At last, they reached the outskirts, where the houses thinned and fields stretched open. Daniel's home stood near the tree line, a small cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. The wood was worn but well kept, the windows clean, and the front door solid. To Lyra, it looked like something from another world. Inside, the warmth hit them instantly. A fire burned steadily. In the stone hearth, the air smelled faintly of bread and herbs. There was a wooden table with 2 chairs, a shelf lined with jars, and in the corner, a small bed already made with thick blankets. Suri walked in slowly, her little hands trailing along the edge of the table, as if afraid it would vanish. "This is for us?" she asked in a small voice. Daniel crouched down to meet her eyes. "Yes, for you." Suri smiled bright and pure, and for a moment, Lyra felt her chest tighten. Daniel set his bag down and began pulling things out. More food, a folded cloak, even a small carved toy. He handed the toy to Suri, who held it like treasure. Lyra stood near the door, not moving, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting to find a hidden catch. Daniel noticed and said quietly, "It's safe here." After setting the food on the shelf, he looked at Lyra. "You can stay as long as you want," he said. "No one will make you leave." She nodded but didn't speak. Her whole life had been about moving from one place to another, never staying anywhere too long. The idea of stopping, of calling somewhere home, felt almost too big to understand. Suri ran to the small bed and climbed onto it, giggling as she wrapped herself in the thick blanket. "Warm," she said, her voice full of joy. Lyra walked over and smoothed her daughter's hair. Her hands were shaking, though she tried to hide it. That evening, Daniel made a simple meal: bread, soup, and roasted vegetables. They ate together at the table, Suri chattering between bites while Daniel listened, occasionally asking her questions. Lyra ate quietly, the warmth of the food spreading through her in a way that felt new and strange. It wasn't just the heat, it was the feeling of eating without fear. When night fell, Suri curled up in the bed, already drifting to sleep. Daniel added another log to the fire, then sat in one of the chairs. Lyra sat across from him, the flickering light painting shadows on the walls. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has," she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "I just did what anyone should." "Not anyone," she replied, her eyes holding his. "Only you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the sound of the crackling fire filling the room. Lyra felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the fragile, fleeting peace of a quiet night in a dangerous place, but the deep kind that comes from knowing someone is watching over you. As she looked around the small cabin, the sturdy walls, the steady fire, the sleeping child, she realized something. This wasn't just Daniel's home anymore. It was theirs. She met his gaze again and said, "We'll take care of this place. And of you." A small smile touched his lips. "And I'll take care of you," he answered. Outside, the mist rolled away as the first stars began to shine. Inside, the fire burned warm. And for the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. Not because the world had changed, but because, in a quiet cabin at the edge of the trees, a new family had begun.